Good morning, everyone, and we are back with the final part in the War Studies 101 Rules of Law series. Now, I'm going to be going on to do things like propaganda, the media in subsequent episodes, but this is the last one in the Laws of War series, and we're back with my good friend Friday the 13th, which is an Airfix Halifax bomber, which is converted by myself many years ago with extended wingtips to make it a later model. Obviously, it's therefore not correct as Friday the 13th, but when I built this kit many years ago, I didn't really understand detail and stuff like that, so I just made it anyway. Now, I've got a Lancaster to build, and I've got a B-17, RAF B-17 to build. Those remain in the loft, and I dug this one out because it is relevant to what we're talking about today. So let's crack on. And firstly, I'll do a quick disclaimer, as I always do. I'm non-political. I am trying to be objective, so you will not find me judging one side or the other. You can make your own decisions. Comments will be disabled because unfortunately there are people on YouTube that, unless you are flag waving for one particular country or another, they will give you loads of hate. How can you say that about my favourite country? Well, I can say that because I'm speaking as a historian, and the job of a historian is to be objective. If you want to find some non-objective content, please go search it up on YouTube. However, as for me, I will remain objective as a good historian should. And if you don't understand what I'm saying, please re-watch the start of this video. Now, the laws of war is, of course, a controversial subject, so I'll be doing this as impartially as possible and looking at history rather than decisions on what is and isn't right. So firstly, we have to say that rules of war have always existed in history. War is mass murder, and without some form of control on war, there is a tendency for war to escalate into the destruction of an entire population or people, and various crimes which are nasty. Now, I've got a child wandering around, so I will be writing some of these crimes down rather than saying them, because I don't want my little one to hear what some of these crimes are. But however, taken to its extreme and its logical conclusion, war is mass murder. Now, there's always been ways of controlling this, and we can look at some of these rules, and the Babylonians had laws for the conduct of war. The Islamic scholars had rules for the conduct of war, and they had laws that governed it, what you could and couldn't do in war. And these were from theorists such as Abu Bakr in the 7th century. The Torah, which is the books of the Old Testament, which the Jews follow as their religious text, they have guides on what you can and can't do in war. Now, some of these guides are somewhat unusual to us, and they're very much dictated by God. So what God said that the Jewish people could do, or the Israelites could do, was important. The Bible itself, and this is where you have a difference between the Jewish faith and the Christian faith, the Bible itself had principles which were then applied and used in the medieval period as a religious guide to war. The Romans and the ancient Greeks, they also had guides and rules on what you could and couldn't do in war. And we're looking at something called jus in bello, or justice in war, the conduct of war. So there certainly was rules in antiquity for what you could and couldn't do. And the idea was that even in that period where things like slavery, where rape, where torture were acceptable and allowed, where you had crime and punishment systems based on capital punishment and torture, there was societal norms within each society to try and prevent what was essentially mass murder getting out of control. They are very different to our period, and things that we would certainly not accept today, such as rape and pillage, were tolerated. So when the Romans took over an area, they would be effectively doing a campaign of rape and a campaign of pillage. So not something that we would accept. Islamic law is very interesting, and I'm sure there would be the same in China, and there would be the same in the Shogun period in Japan, where you have various prohibitions on what you can and can't do. In fact, the prohibitions in the Shogun period in Japan are very interesting because they actually regulate the use of firearms. But certainly within Islamic law, there were things that you could and couldn't do and ways that you had to treat prisoners. Now, the medieval period is the one which we tend to focus on the most in the West. And the reason which we tend to focus on that is because a lot of the texts and a lot of the source material that we have from the Roman period, from the ancient Greek period, from the Islamic world, from the Chinese period has been lost or destroyed. So we tend to know a lot more about the medieval period because of the way it was written and recorded. Now, the Chinese scholars, the Islamic scholars, were probably way more advanced for their time than the medieval Christian scholars. However, for various reasons, we have a abundance of surviving texts for the Christian medieval period, which we don't have for other periods. So we have a lot of reference to go to. Now, it's worth saying that unfortunately a lot of this is embellished. So if you look at Henry V, Henry V is heavily embellished, and it's embellished by Shakespeare. Shakespeare wrote very favourably about Henry V, and one of the reasons that he did that was because the ruler at his time was a descendant of Henry. So if you started writing bad things about the house of your ruler, well, you were likely to get your head chopped off. So there is some embellishment here to the texts. But what we can say, and we can look at tapestries, we can look at what has remained, the Bayeux tapestry, we can look at other tapestries, and most medieval castles would have had tapestries lining the walls. We've got oral sources of history which have been passed through the generations, embellished, yes, and then written down eventually in the 16th, 17th and 18th centuries. Now, in the medieval period, there were very strict laws on war. There were very strict laws on battle, and battle was the arbiter where God decided who was the victor. Now, at the time, you had what's called the barons. You had a feudal system and you had kings. Now, the barons were essentially mafia people. They had their knights, many of them were knights with their retinas, they had their castles, and they raided their opponents. They engaged in battle. It was very strictly controlled. One of the reasons was it was to do with money. So if you were a knight and you had a battle, sometimes battles were fought ritualistically, where they just bashed each other over the head, causing a lot of head injuries. But there were also laws in this period covering ransom. So you could capture someone else's son, you could capture someone else's land, and you could ransom them or their land. It was effectively a form of mafiosi protection. The baron looked after his town. In return, he got money for that. He provided them with protection. He had to do so many days a year for the king, except during harvest season. And when they did have wars, they were often very ritualistic. Now, these laws did fall apart on certain occasions, and one of them, one of the bloodiest rules of war we can look at is the laws of siege. Now, in the law of siege, what happens is if you have your opponent's castle here, give it the moat, surrounded by the moat, and castles at the time, the medieval castle, a fighting castle, was incredibly small, and it had to be small because it was often on the top of a hill, and underneath you would have your medieval town, and then you would have a thinner wall, a larger wall around that. But the actual keep, the actual castle, was often on the top of the hill. Fighting castle was small. Small for a reason, so it could sustain for a long period, and it was also small because it was defensible. So first you would surround your enemy's castle. Then you would give them a call to surrender. And if they did not surrender and you had to take the castle via siege, via undermining it, that's going under, or whether you were going to scale it, make a breach using a catapult and then scale it and then get to the inner wall and then climb up here. All the time you've got arrows coming down at you. You're losing lots and lots of your knights, lots and lots of your people. When you eventually capture it, they forfeit their lives. So it is okay to kill the occupants, and it is okay to effectively take them prisoner. Now, sometimes that would have been a form of enslavement, putting them in dungeons for ransom, etc., etc. But the main thing is there is an idea of forfeit, of what happened to the occupants inside this area once it was taken. Their lives were at the hands of the victors. So they often were put to death. You also have, in this period, religious and cultural clashes. You have a progression to total war, and we can see this in the Wars of the Roses, where you have two families fighting out for the control of the medieval kingdom of England. You have the wars in Ireland, where British nobles are taking land in Ireland, and you have a push towards total war. The most misunderstood period is around the Crusades, and you have Saladin, and you have the Crusaders, the crusading army. Now, even in the Crusades, you had limits, you had rules. Now, one of the big tensions within this period was around people that didn't follow the rules, and one of the historical examples, although it is embellished, we have is the Knights Templar, who obviously didn't follow the established rules at the time, and you have a push towards total war. And what that means is that both in the Wars of the Roses and in the Crusades, you end up with a bloodbath, and you tend to end up with a bloodbath for the army that has retreated or lost the battle. The judgment of God is applied. The retreating army, the ones that have lost, when they flee the battlefield, they suffer the most. You have horrific war crimes going on, and you have breaches within established agreements. So the Knights Templar have breached agreements with Saladin and the Saracens. Now, running up to World War II, you have progress towards total war. So you have the Revolutionary War. And these are the wars where revolutionary France embarks on campaigns. Before that, you pretty much have set-piece battles. You have battles between princes to take different kingdoms, battles like Blenheim, but there is a push towards total war. Now, total war is where you're engaging the civilian population. You're engaging the armies. You're fighting scorched earth wars, both in Russia and in the American Civil War, where you have raids. You have raids going on into the south. You have houses being burnt. You have farms being burnt. As gunpowder develops and as firepower develops, you have machine guns. You have barbed wire. You have entanglements. You have progress towards total war, the engagement of the whole of the state in the war effort. You have navies fighting at sea. And in World War I, you really have the culmination of the progress towards total war, where you have gas, you have chemical weapons, you have things which were hitherto unforeseen, and they are all employed in the service of winning the war. This is what Clausewitz would say war is going towards. Without friction, it's going towards total war. The annihilation of your enemy's people, the annihilation of your enemy's will to fight through the destruction of the civilian populace and the destruction of the military. And there isn't really a system of rules governing that. Things are getting more and more brutal. You can see that in the Boer War. The Boer War was obviously a fairly limited war, but even within that, the British Army set up the first concentration camps. Unlike the German ones, but similar in the idea that you're concentrating people together. Those people are often not well treated and subject to disease, forced displacement of population, and war, what we would regard quite rightly now as war crimes. it wasn't a war crime then because there wasn't the rules to govern it. However, societally, some people were aghast. Now, post-World War One, in the 1920s, you started to have the concept of restrictions. People were aghast at what was happening, and you had the anti-war movement. And this is where you have the war poets, and the war poets are coming out and they're saying, do you know what? That war was really horrible. We had to wander around in mud. There were dead people everywhere. The rats were eating everyone and everything. It was horrific. Let's regulate this. So you started to have rules via the League of Nations. Now, those rules very quickly got overturned, and they got overturned by actions in Spain. That was the start. And then even worse actions in Manchuria, where the Imperial Japanese conducted what was effectively mass rape, mass murder, torture, the experimentation on the civilian population, the growth into what became Unit 731, and horrific crimes against people, which was stomach churning. So these restrictions, the anti-war movement had started, the rules from the League of Nations, they didn't have enforcement. They were just out there. And if you didn't obey the rules and you were General Franco's German-supported army in Spain, well, you were bombing cities. And the bomber became the big threat. And the phrase was, the bomber will always get through. And that started the growth towards these four-engined heavies, certainly within the RAF. Nazi Germany never really developed the four-engine heavy for various reasons, but it certainly wanted to. And the Americans, of course, did develop heavy bombing. But you have a sickening spiral to World War II. And in World War II, you have total war. But you don't just have total war in the fact that you've got armies fighting, you've got navies fighting, you've got the Blitz, you've got civilian populations being bombed, you've got firestorm raids, Hamburg and Dresden. You've got firestorm raids in Japan. You've got the low-level firebombing of the Japanese mainland. But what you also have is you have some ideological warfare going on, and the biggest example of this was, of course, the extermination and the attempted extermination of the Jewish people by the Nazi regime. Now, certainly Stalin was no angel. However, when you look at the ideological bias of the Nazi regime and what they are trying to achieve, and the way that they prioritize the extermination of the Jewish people, even over diverting their own weapons trains, their own troop trains, to allow people to be carried to the concentration camp, you have total war and you have ideological destruction and genocide. Same thing in Manchuria. Now, in Manchuria, it is slightly different. In Manchuria, there is less of an ideological intent to exterminate the Chinese people, but there is more of a lack of sympathy and lack of care. In many ways, killing for the Imperial Army becomes a sport. Horrific crimes by Unit 731 against the Chinese people, including injecting children with plague, including using the population for sick experiments. That all goes on. The war escalates to total war in the atomic bombing of the Japanese cities of Nagasaki and Hiroshima. Firebombing has devastated Germany. Firebombing has devastated Japan. The atomic bombing ends the war. This is total war. Now, whether it was right to use the atomic bombs is a question I'm not going to answer. It certainly was right for Nazi Germany and Imperial Japan to be defeated. Because when you've got the Imperial Japanese killing Chinese people en masse for sport, you have to deal with them. Where you've got Nazi Germany attempting to genocide and wipe out the entire Jewish population, you have to deal with them. Now, in many ways, these were secondary objectives to the Allies. The Allies didn't really focus upon these objectives. In the case of Unit 731 and its atrocities, they were quickly forgotten by the Americans after World War II. In the case of the genocide against the Jewish people, you could say that they didn't focus on it. You could say they didn't necessarily know, or you could say that it was a shock when they found the concentration camps at Belsen. It was, however, stomach-churning, and there was a step after World War II to regulate it. This came out of Nuremberg. So Nuremberg trials was where they put the leaders of Nazi Germany on trial, and they came up with concepts such as the crime of aggression. It was very much a victor's peace. You did not find RAF Bomber Command crews being brought to justice in the same way. Now, there were many in the British state that regarded that the work of RAF Bomber Command was unpalatable, and they regarded Bomber Harris's theories as being slightly out there. Was what Bomber Harris was doing, was it a war crime? Some, even at that time, argued that it was. So very quickly after World War II, you find that Bomber Command is quickly forgotten, and it does not receive the medals and the rewards that RAF Fighter Command, Coastal Command and the Army do. So there was a sense, even within this period, that the firebombing of Dresden and Hamburg had gone too far. However, this was a victor's peace in many ways. Now, was it against the rules of war to do that? And was it against the rules of war to bomb cities? Well, it was against societal norms. However, the rules of wars had not evolved to the same way that they did afterwards. So therefore, what you are looking at is you are looking at things which even then went against societal norms. But who are you dealing with? Well, you are dealing with the Nazi regime, and you are dealing with genocidal people. Or when you're dropping the atomic bomb, you are dealing with people that kill other populations for sport. Torture, rape, and other horrific acts. So, RAF Bomber Command, for that reason, is not regarded as having committed war crimes. However, there was some reluctance to pursue that strategy again, and post-World War II, you have the Geneva Conventions, signed between 1949 and 1954, a lot of conventions. That forms the basis of what's called international humanitarian law, which applies to all combatants in war. You also have various treaties, and cluster munition treaties is one example. You have treaties on mines. Now, not everyone has signed these treaties. America hasn't signed them. Russia hasn't signed them. But there is an expectation that all parties involved in war adhere to the laws of war. And this can now be judged in the post-World War II environment. The ultimate judge is the United Nations Security Council when it can agree, when it's not vetoing itself. But the United Nations Security Council can judge when someone has committed war crimes. The International Criminal Court can make judgments and then refer them to the Security Council for action. The Security Council can impose resolutions. It can go to war justly based on those resolutions, or it can impose costs and decisions onto the parties in the war. You've also got the International Court of Justice, and then you've got domestic courts. So some crimes, such as a soldier in NATO who goes out and murders some Afghani civilians, well, they may face military punishments in the military system and go to jail. You've got non-governmental organisations such as Amnesty International gathering evidence. So the evidence is fed through the various courts. It's fed into the United Nations Security Council, who then can make decisions on determining the outcome. Now, the clearest place that you can see this at the minute is the war in Ukraine. less so with Israel and Hamas. However, with the war in Ukraine, there has been judgments made by the United Nations, the General Assembly. You've got the UN itself, and they have referred these judgments to the United Nations Security Council, saying that Russia has committed war crimes. Unfortunately, Russia just vetoes those. And unfortunately, many of these countries, the USA included, are not signatories to the International Criminal Court, nor are they signatories to the cluster munition laws. So then you start to have a weakening in the process where even signatories to the cluster munitions courts are supplying Ukraine with cluster munitions. So we're in a situation where we've got laws of war, but we're in a situation where the laws of war are breaking apart. Now, the rules-based order, Captain America and NATO, they get around this problem via what they call their targeting process. So NATO armies, NATO air forces, NATO navies will receive training in the laws of war. It is part of the training for all officers to go through. It's part of the training for all soldiers to go through. And when you join the British Army, like many of my friends did, they received a book and they received training. Now, does it mean that the NATO armies and NATO forces do not make mistakes? It doesn't. They do make mistakes. America managed to kill around 400 people in Afghanistan by bombing a wedding. But these are generally mistakes. These are generally when procedures haven't been followed. Do they always judge and do they always hold these soldiers to account? No. Taking an American soldier to the International Criminal Court is a big no. America will veto it, America will prevent it, America will stop it. Both Russia and America unfortunately use the International Criminal Court for their purposes. So America will engage with the International Criminal Court to provide examples of Russian war crimes. But don't expect to see an American soldier before the court. They do not recognise its authority. So we're in this position where even members of the United Nations Security Council are using the international courts for their own political and propaganda purposes. And that prevents countries like Ukraine from ever receiving justice that they expect to receive. So there's been various rulings stating that Russia owes Ukraine reparations. There's been various rulings stating that Russia has committed war crimes. Russia disputes those, and the United Nations Security Council just vetoes them. So whilst we have all these systems for managing and preventing war crimes continue to date. Now, the way NATO gets around this is it has a established targeting process. So your intelligence goes in on the target. An assessment is then made. Is the target worth hitting? Will the costs to the civilian population in the area be too high? If they are going to be too high, it will be referred to lawyers. The lawyers will say, yes, we need to hit that target. You need to hit that target. It is fine. There is an element of discretion. There is an element of acceptance of collateral damage, and there is a choice of weapons that is made. So, for example, if you can hit the target with a £500 bomb, a guided bomb, a PGM, precision guided munition, that might be your chosen weapon for striking that target. You could just evaporate that target with a £2,000 weapon, but if it's in a civilian area, that would not be proportionate, and the lawyers would tell the people making the targeting decision, no, that's going to cause you problems. The strike then goes in. Now, there are mistakes made, and there is then a review process, which goes on to determine whether the strike was successful and whether it breached any of the laws of war. So what are these laws of war, and what do they say, and why does NATO regard itself as having a far superior prosecution of war to that carried out by Russia? Well, firstly, the rules of war apply to both the belligerent parties, normally states, but they also apply to non-state actors. So if you are a terrorist, not only are you acting illegally in most cases, breaching domestic law, committing crimes such as murder, because you don't have a legal recourse to force, but you're also breaching the rules of war. Double whammy. If you are a state, you are governed by the laws of war. If you are a non-state actor, so a militiaman, a resistance movement, you have to adhere to these rules as well. The difference and where it becomes murky is in terms of mercenary and in terms of spies. So mercenaries and spies do not necessarily have the same protections under the Geneva Convention, the international humanitarian law, as the other combatants do, established combatants. So there are rules for the defender and there are rules for the attacker. So firstly, the defender needs to evacuate. The defender needs to move the civilian population away from war, needs to protect its civilian population. It also needs to distinguish between who is and who isn't a combatant. Now this can be done relatively easily, and this is a person with a gun. I'm terrible at drawing. But you can have an armband. So the armband is put on, say, someone wearing civilian uniform when they take up arms to be part of a resistance movement to differentiate them. And once they put that armband on and once they engage in combat, they are meant to distinguish and become separate to the civilian population. The defender and the attacker are not meant to target hospitals. They're not meant to target schools. They're not meant to target places of worship. And once people are surrendered, they are meant to accord them rights of prisoners of war. The attacker must discriminate. You cannot fire weapons, as you have done in the past, into civilian areas to attack military targets with no discrimination and expect to remain exempt from the rules of war. And this is why the case is being made against the Russians. Are they discriminating in their targeting? Now, the Russians will say, oh, Ukraine is shooting down our missiles. And when Ukraine attacks Russia, they'll say, oh, Russia's shooting down our missiles. It does not exempt them from the rules of war. In fact, if you are attacking, the obligations are stronger for the attacker. So the attacker has the burden. It's on them. They have to demonstrate the discrimination. They have to demonstrate the proportionality. They have to demonstrate that they are not targeting civilians. They have to demonstrate that they are targeting military targets only. Now, where this becomes more complicated is in terms of critical infrastructure. So can you attack critical infrastructure? Yes, you can. The Americans attacked critical infrastructure in Iraq. They blew out the power grid. They used graphite weapons to take down power lines. They used precision-guided munitions to take down power lines. The reason they were doing that is because the power grid gives the air defence systems power, your command and control systems. But the attacker has to demonstrate a discrimination between civilians and military targets. Now, I'm not going to make any further judgments on this because the war between Russia and Ukraine is ongoing. There is evidence that is still to be gathered and there are trials that are still to be heard. And now we come on to what's called the very naughty list, and various things are not allowed in war. Now, these include sexual offences, these include torture, and these include genocide. Now, the key with genocide is it has to be linked to an intent, and also what's called ethnic cleansing. So this is where you remove a population from an area via bombing, via threats, by fear. Now, the war in Ukraine is going on, and unfortunately there is propaganda on both sides. For example, some of the allegations that have been made when investigated by Amnesty International, and this is both sides, so please don't get me wrong, both sides they have been found to not have evidence. Likewise, these trials are ongoing, so I will not comment further on them, and I don't think you should until that they have been tried and the evidence has been brought out. So where are we now? Well, we're in a situation where the rules of war are fast disintegrating. They're disintegrating because of actions by Russia, and they're disintegrating due to horrific conflict in the Middle East, which I won't comment on because, quite frankly, if you make a comment on it, one, we don't know the history, and two, it's open to misunderstanding and criticism. So I'll not be commenting on that. If you want to go and read and make your own decisions on whether Russia is compliant with the laws of war and whether Ukraine is compliant with the laws of war, I would encourage you to do some reading. Okay. Go to the International Criminal Court website, type in IHL and have a look. You can make your own decisions. I hope this has helped, and I hope this helps you understand what is and what is going on in the world.